The infamous Batman comic book character Joker once said, "The only way to survive in this world is to live without rules," and a real young man took this quote as a guide to action. However, when some people live without rules, it can be quite dangerous for those around them. Jaime Osuna smirked and waved at the family of the woman he had killed. At that moment, the judge was sentencing him to life imprisonment for the brutal torture and murder of a 36-year-old young mother. Dressed in prison uniform with tattoos on his face, the criminal wanted everyone to know he felt no remorse. He even gave the judge a thumbs up, showing his agreement with the sentence. This was exactly what Osuna wanted, because he was tired of being part of society. Some crimes are so horrific that it becomes difficult to imagine they were committed by humans. Jaime Osuna is one of the notorious serial killers who found joy and thrills in torturing, enslaving, and taking the lives of his victims. People called him the real-life Joker and the man with 1,000 faces. Due to his numerous tattoos, including the famous Joker smile and a pentagram on his forehead, many believed that the real Joker's criminal activities in adulthood were influenced by his difficult childhood. Jaime Osuna was born in Bakersfield, California, on March 7, 1988. His mother, Michelle, was only 19 at the time, and his father was 21. The relationship between his parents could hardly be called normal. His father was very violent and often raised his hand against his pregnant wife. When Michelle was 9 months pregnant, he kicked her in the stomach so hard that it affected the baby. The young woman forgave the child's father for this incident, and they continued their relationship. But a visual reminder of that day remained for life. Little Jaime was born with a noticeable scar under his eye. Eventually, the child's father abandoned Michelle when their son was 1 year old. The young woman was left with 2 children and almost no means of survival. However, she wasn't alone for long. Michelle began dating a man named Jeff and soon married him, moving into his house with her 2 children. As it turned out, Jeff also had a son from a previous relationship. The new boyfriend needed Michelle, but not her children, and it was very noticeable how intolerant he was of the 2 foreign offspring he had to support. Jeff clearly couldn't stand either boy, but for some reason, younger Jaime got the worst of it. Once, the newlyweds were returning from fishing with the children, and little Jaime was very tired, so he started crying and being fussy. Jeff tolerated the boy's behavior for a while, but then became so angry that he turned around, opened the door, and pushed Jaime, still strapped in his car seat, out of the moving car. Michelle was horrified because she saw a truck driving right behind them. Fortunately, the seat landed vertically and didn't end up in the traffic lane. Jeff stopped the car so the mother could go back and retrieve the child from the road, but refused to take Jaime to the hospital since there were no visible injuries. According to Michelle, he wouldn't even have allowed her to do it herself. However, when Jaime grew older, doctors discovered that he had suffered minor brain damage as a result of the incident. Jaime was still very young when, for some misconduct, his stepfather tied him to a tree outside and began whipping him with a rope. This time, Michelle didn't tolerate it and called the police. This was the only time she intervened because she felt Jeff had crossed a line. Strange that the woman didn't feel this earlier when her son was thrown from a moving car. Jeff managed to untie the child, and when the police arrived, he tried to explain it away, saying it was just a joke, they were playing. But the red marks on Jaime's body told a different story. Jeff was arrested and charged with abuse, though he returned a few days later and everything started again. Friends, over 90% of viewers watch videos without subscribing to the channel. Check if you're subscribed. If not, please be so kind as to subscribe to the channel to support me. By that time, Michelle and Jeff had 2 children of their own, whom he treated completely differently, but Jeff never managed to accept his 2 stepsons. It seemed the boys irritated him more with each passing day. Once, in a fit of anger, he threw a fork at Michelle's older son. The fork didn't cause much damage, But when the boy's grandparents found out about this, they were shocked, and fortunately for Jaime's older brother, they took him in. However, they left Jaime behind because for some reason, the grandfather also disliked his younger grandson, and the boy had to endure his stepfather's anger and abuse throughout his childhood. Michelle said that Jaime was very loving and affectionate, but others inexplicably disliked him. When the child tried to approach his mother and hug her, it would infuriate his stepfather. When Jeff would punish Jaime by not letting him eat or putting his plate on the floor like a dog's, Michelle was deeply distressed and felt sorry for her son, but she couldn't intervene because she was terrified of her husband, as she had also suffered abuse from him many times. Jeff regularly told her that if she ever tried to leave, he would punish her. One day, Michelle couldn't take it anymore, grabbed some belongings, took the children, and left the house. Her husband immediately caught up with her, beat her, and then covered her with salt to make sure she would remember the lesson for a long time. At school, Jaime was a withdrawn, unsociable child, but none of the teachers inquired about what was happening with him. No one ever asked any questions or expressed any concern about it. Over the years, the boy's resentment toward his stepfather began to manifest as hidden aggression. Jaime started abusing small animals and harming himself. When he turned 12, his grandparents had a change of heart and took him in to raise him, but it was already too late. Michelle admitted that by that time she had noticed changes in her son. He was no longer that sweet and affectionate little boy. Jaime had become completely emotionless, detached from everything happening around him, and withdrawn into himself. A few years after this, his stepfather, Jeff, died of a heart attack. In his teenage years, Jaime caused many problems for his grandparents. He joined a small street gang and began breaking the law. He was charged with petty theft, possession, and use of illegal substances, hooliganism, and numerous fights. His offenses became increasingly severe and dangerous over time. Moreover, Jaime himself began using illegal drugs at age 15. Once at school, Jaime got into a dispute with another student and stabbed him during a fight. As a result of this altercation, Jaime spent the next 4 years locked up in a juvenile detention center. Less than a year after Jaime was released, he broke the law again while still on probation. The young man ended up at a house party hosted by a mother for her 16-year-old child. A woman named Jane thought it would be better for her son to have fun at home under her supervision than wandering the night streets with intoxicated teenagers. A supervised house party guaranteed her child's safety. Previously, Jane had worked as a prison nurse and psychotherapist. Once she was brutally attacked by an inmate at the facility where she worked, after which she changed professions. Jane fully funded the party, bought drinks, prepared snacks, and started having fun with the teenagers. She drank a bit too much and began dancing with one of the teenagers. Her nephew didn't like the woman's behavior and persuaded Jaime, who was standing nearby, to deal with the guy. Jaime didn't need much convincing. He went to the kitchen, got a knife, and stabbed the teenager who was dancing with Jane. The wound wasn't serious, but it led to another arrest for violating probation conditions. It turned out Jaime had his own motives for stopping the dancing, as he had taken an immediate liking to the woman. After the house party incident, Jaime was immediately sent back to prison, but he and Jane maintained constant communication. They wrote to each other almost daily and often talked on the phone. They called themselves good friends, friends with a 17-year age difference. Jane explained that Jaime was very intelligent, and she enjoyed talking with him. She described him as a gentleman who loved discussing philosophy and psychology, and additionally, he was very charming and captivated Jane with his masculine beauty. When his release date approached, she didn't hesitate to drive to the prison to meet him. During his time in prison, Jaime had gotten several tattoos, including the Joker's smile on his face. He was already an interesting person to Jane, and the tattoo added a certain mysteriousness and uniqueness to him. The young woman said she never took the guy seriously. She just had fun with him. After his release from prison, they immediately went to a motel, paid for the night, and spent time together as two adults. A couple of weeks later, Jane found out she was pregnant. She hadn't considered Jaime as a potential father at all, especially after he got facial tattoos, but Jaime was actually in love with Jane, and this made the woman reconsider her views. She decided that maybe Jaime would make a decent father, and that she needed to try looking at him from a different perspective. This was Jane's fourth child, and it was in her interest to try to settle down, take this young man seriously, and give him a chance. When Jaime proposed to his beloved, she accepted. In February 2010, the newlyweds exchanged wedding vows. Jaime was 22 years old, and his bride was 39. Despite the age difference, the young man was very excited and happy. He was involved in the wedding preparations and dreamed of becoming a father soon. However, just days after the wedding, Jane began to notice why her husband associated himself with the Joker. She saw another side of this man. The sweet young man would transform, as if by flipping a switch, into a jealous and controlling husband who abused Jane both physically and emotionally throughout her pregnancy. He behaved exactly like the men in his own mother's life. About 6 months later, the Osunas had such a severe argument that Jaime grabbed the urn containing Jane's father's ashes and left the house. It was very important for the pregnant woman to get the urn back. She tried calling him, but it was useless. In desperation, Jane called the police, which resulted in Jaime landing back in prison. Unfortunately, her father's ashes were never found, and Jaime spent the next 6 months behind bars before being released on parole. Naturally, by that time, Jane had already given birth to their son. Somehow, the convicted man managed to convince his wife to give him a chance to become a good father and model family man. He remembered his childhood and wanted his child to experience something different. Jaime assured Jane that he had changed and things would be different now. But people rarely change, and all the changes in Jaime's character were negative. He returned to using illegal substances, which only intensified his aggressive outbursts toward his wife. Jaime sought reactions to his actions, but Jane, knowing what her husband was trying to achieve, learned to simply ignore him. She essentially stopped acknowledging what he was saying, though sometimes she still had to stand up to him. One evening, her husband literally went berserk. He smashed a photo frame, grabbed a piece of glass, and cut his arm. The cut was deep, and Jane was frightened, especially when she realized he had cut a vein. However, Jaime acted like a madman. He grabbed some tape, wrapped the wound, and pulled a black sock over it. He absolutely refused to go to the hospital. Another evening, her husband again started expressing his dissatisfaction with his wife, while she simply ignored his words, focusing on her maternal duties. To get Jane's attention, Jaime approached the bed where her 7-year-old son from a previous relationship was sleeping, and looking his wife straight in the eyes, simply pushed him onto the parquet floor. Jane, unlike Jaime's mother, wasn't going to let her children be hurt. She went to the kitchen, grabbed 2 knives, and threw them right at her husband. Naturally, Jaime didn't expect such a reaction. He left and did something foolish that violated his parole conditions, resulting in him being behind bars again. Jaime was released on Halloween 2011. By then, his face was completely covered in Joker-like tattoos, and when everyone else took off their scary masks after the holiday, Jaime didn't have that option. His mask was permanent. The man had no intention of calming down and resumed stalking his wife, threatening her with violence, scaring her by saying he would take the children, and lurking outside her house windows. Jane had to call the police almost every day. Since Jaime wasn't taking any specific actions, officers stopped responding to the woman's requests. But one day everything changed. Jane immediately understood this from Jaime's tone. Her husband wasn't just threatening to come over. He told her to watch the news because he had taken the life of a woman at the El Morocco motel. This was on November 8, 2011. Jane called the police again, knowing her husband was capable of committing a crime. She explained to the dispatcher that Jaime Osuna was a real psycho and that he had talked about some woman he allegedly killed in a motel room. She asked them to verify the information, worried that the victim might need help, but the police took no action, considering it another provocation from Jane's unstable husband. 5 days after the phone conversation with Jaime, Jane turned on the news and saw a report that an employee at the El Morocco Motel had discovered a woman's body in one of the rooms. The victim was 36-year-old Yvette Pina, a mother of 6 children. She was a Sunday school teacher, but had recently become addicted to illegal substances and was struggling hard to fight the harmful dependency. Yvette Pina's childhood was no less difficult than Jaime Osuna's. Her mother gave birth to her at 15 when she was still essentially a child herself. As Yvette grew up, she had to take on the responsibilities of running the household and caring for her younger sister Danielle, who suffered from a congenital illness. Their mother was always working and spending time with her boyfriend, only appearing at home in the evenings. Due to such negligent treatment from their closest relative, both girls were abused by their mother's boyfriend, but even this didn't make the woman think about her daughter's well-being. She didn't believe Yvette's words, deciding that she just wanted attention. Yvette couldn't cope with the traumatic experience. She started drinking alcohol to bury her pain deeper. By age 16, Yvette had given birth to a son. At first, everything went well, and she had several more children, but in 2004, she began using psychostimulants, and her life went downhill. Yvette lost custody of her children. In 2011, Yvette was arrested for possession of illegal substances and gave birth to her 6th child while in prison. The baby was immediately taken away, which was another devastating blow for the woman. So Yvette turned to her sister for help. Younger sister Danielle posted bail for her. After being released, Yvette did everything possible to get her child back. The baby was in intensive care, and Yvette visited the hospital every day to see him. She stayed clean for several months, but one day she was told that the child was going to be adopted, and this news left Yvette in shock. She relapsed and now spent most of her time at the El Morocco Motel because she couldn't afford to rent a house. Then, on November 13, 2011, Danielle received news that her sister had been found dead in a motel room. Due to the severity of the wounds, and because the body had been in the room for several days after death, it was decided to cremate Yvette Pina. The relatives couldn't bear to see her tortured remains. According to experts, the woman had been lying there for about 5 days. The coroner determined that Yvette died from blunt force trauma and asphyxiation, and prosecutors described what the perpetrator did to her as something truly horrific, refusing to go into detailed descriptions. That's when the police became interested in Jane's call. They spoke again with Jane, who told them about her deranged husband's phone call. When Jaime was brought in for questioning after being arrested at his grandparents' house, the man denied everything. According to him, if he had said something like that to Jane, it was only to scare her. Then Jaime started accusing his wife, trying to undermine her credibility. He questioned Jane's choice to marry him. The man asked the officers why an adult woman would marry someone like him, and then claimed that his wife was crazy and wanted to frame him. Jaime kept talking about his wife for a long time. The investigators listening to his monologue noticed one thing: Yvette Pina strongly resembled Jane, and when the arrested man was pointed to this fact, he confirmed that the women did indeed look similar. Could this have been the main motive for the crime? It's possible that Jaime decided to take out his feelings and contempt for Jane Osuna on a similar-looking woman. After this suggestion, Jaime refused to talk to the police anymore. He was taken into custody and placed in the county jail, but even from prison, Jaime continued to stalk Jane. He called Child Protective Services several times, trying to get her children taken away. When she blocked his number, he started harassing her through acquaintances. Once, Jaime sent his wife a package containing a dead rat in the mail. The man always told Jane that his imprisonment didn't mean she was safe. One time, He was caught attempting to organize an attack on his own wife from prison when they intercepted a letter to another inmate. The letter contained Jane's address and instructions on how to get rid of her. At some point, Mrs. Jane did end up behind bars after her son told someone that his mom had hit him. It's unknown whether this actually happened or if the father somehow convinced his son to tell a lie. When Jane was being transported to court in a prison bus, she was attacked by another inmate. It later turned out that Jaime had convinced a Latin American woman to commit the crime against his wife in exchange for illegal substances. The guards barely managed to separate the women before either of them got hurt. The charges against Jane were eventually dropped, and she regained custody of her youngest child, Jaime's son. However, this affected her other children who were given to their biological fathers. So, he did manage to ruin his wife's life to some extent. While in jail awaiting trial, Jaime admitted that he had indeed seen Yvette on November 13th, but she was alive, and he didn't know what happened to her after that. Jaime publicly expressed hope that Yvette's family would soon find the real villain. He didn't admit his guilt even after being told that by November 13th, Yvette Pina had already been dead for 5 days, and consequently, he couldn't have possibly seen her. But Jaime stood his ground. Jaime explained that people came to this motel to buy and use illegal substances, and that the rooms at El Morocco were used for intimate services. The man even gave authorities the names of other people who were there and might have had something to do with Yvette's death. Jaime was denied release on bail, so he remained behind bars. His trial was postponed so many times that he ended up spending 6 years in prison without a sentence. The trial date was set for March 27, 2017, but before that, on March 24th, Jaime gave an interview to a journalist, shocking her with his candor. By that time, his entire face was covered in tattoos, and Jaime looked like a real villain, which in fact he was. Jaime called himself the Joker and the man with 1,000 faces. He constantly added new tattoos, making him almost unrecognizable. Each new tattoo changed his appearance, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. The difference between how he looked now and how he looked 10 years ago was striking. The female reporter sat just a few steps away from the criminal and couldn't take her eyes off his face. She listened as Jaime told her horrifying details about what he did to Yvette Pina at the El Morocco motel. The journalist said the information was so disturbing that she chose not to disclose it, as she didn't want the victim's family to live with the pain of knowing about it. Jaime admitted he was guilty of everything he was accused of. He enjoyed what he experienced while taking the woman's life. If given the opportunity, he would do it again without hesitation, and if he were ever released, he would commit another crime and take someone else's life. Jaime compared killing to a high, to illegal substances, to an addiction. He said he would prefer to kill someone rather than spend a night with the most beautiful woman in the world. Jaime also confessed to the journalist that Yvette Pina wasn't his first victim. There were a couple more people who suffered at his hands, but since he cleaned the crime scenes well, no one would ever be able to connect these victims to him. In Yvette's case, Jaime deliberately left his fingerprints and DNA at the crime scene that could lead to him. This was his plan. Jaime wanted to be caught because he no longer wanted to be part of society. The inmate didn't mind spending the rest of his days in prison. The only thing he feared was the death penalty, but he had thought this through. His plan included appearing in court, changing his guilty plea, and using the 2 other crimes that the police didn't know about as leverage. This could guarantee that he wouldn't receive a death sentence. The reporter tried to get more information from the inmate about the 2 other crimes, but Jaime only briefly mentioned that one victim was a 27-year-old man whom he killed while still a teenager. The second was a 32-year-old woman whom Jaime encountered when he was 18. When asked about any remorse, Jaime laughed and said he regretted nothing. This man didn't consider himself a monster. He just wasn't afraid to indulge his own desires without letting society influence him. Jaime believed he made himself who he was and fully understood the consequences awaiting him, but had no regrets. Jaime emphasized that he would take the plea deal not to spare Yvette's family from a longer trial where disturbing photos would be shown. He simply preferred to go to prison rather than wait several more years for trial. After this interview, the reporter took a long time to process everything. She didn't know what the right thing to do was, whether to take the information from Jaime to the prosecutor or let events unfold naturally. Eventually, she decided to wait for the trial and see what would happen. As promised, during the trial, to avoid the death penalty, Jaime pleaded guilty. His plan worked. Because of this, the family didn't have to see shocking photos of Yvette's body or hear the horrific details of how she died. The prosecutor had to accept this and agreed that it would be difficult for the relatives to hear all these horrors. Yvette Pina's sister asked the judge to schedule the sentencing for May 15, 2017. This would have been Yvette's birthday. She would have turned 42 if she hadn't crossed paths with Jaime. Neither the judge nor lawyers from either side objected, so on that day, Jaime was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Yvette's family members were in the courtroom when Jaime appeared before the court. He smiled broadly at them and waved. At the time, everyone present considered this mockery of the victim's family. During his detention at the State Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, Jaime often wrote things in blood on his cell walls. Later, Jaime was transferred to Corcoran State Prison in California. There, the 31-year-old criminal was classified as extremely dangerous and prone to violence, and they tried to keep him in solitary confinement. However, Jaime managed to break into a neighboring cell and slash another inmate's face. The attack resulted in 67 stitches for the victim. On March 9, 2019, 2 years after his conviction, the real Joker made national headlines again after brutally killing his cellmate, an inmate named Luis Romero. The 44-year-old Romero had been convicted for participating in a killing. As a teenager, he was a member of a gang that participated in an attack that ended in death. Romero had spent 27 years in prison and was soon to be released on parole. For some reason, the man was placed in the cell where Jaime lived, and a couple of days after the transfer, he was found decapitated and disemboweled. Jaime hung body parts on the cell walls as grotesque decorations. For the killing, Jaime used a safety razor blade that he had fashioned into a knife. He cut out Romero's eye, severed a finger, ripped out several ribs and a piece of lung, then decapitated his cellmate and cut his mouth from ear to ear with the blade, creating the notorious Joker smile. He took several photos of the mutilated body, which were later confiscated. When guards came for morning check, Jaime appeared before them, wearing a necklace made from rope, with a part of Romero's body hanging as a pendant. Jaime's motive was completely unclear. There were no conflicts between these two inmates. They had lived in the same cell for about 2 days. Jaime Osuna was known as a very unpredictable and violent person. He was classified as an extremely dangerous inmate, which is why Romero's family was very upset about the fact that right before his release, Romero was placed with a murderer. Many facility workers were genuinely afraid of Jaime, and other inmates called him insane. Jaime's file stated that he should have limited contact with other inmates and prison staff. He was always kept in solitary confinement, and before Luis Romero, Jaime had never had cellmates because of how dangerous he was considered to be. Jaime was transferred to Stockton Prison for inmates requiring medical or psychiatric care. In March 2021, Jaime was deemed incompetent and unable to be held responsible for his actions. Since then, he has been diagnosed with a schizophrenia spectrum disorder. Jaime's former wife, Jane, divorced him. She had to undergo multiple courses of psychotherapy after losing custody of her children and the destructive relationship with Jaime. Jane often questions why her husband directed his anger and aggression at Yvette Pina, a woman who had many similarities to herself. She felt enormous guilt toward the children who lost their mother in such a horrible way. Mrs. Jane knew that it was she whom Jaime felt hostility toward and wanted to harm in the same way, but for some reason, he hurt someone else instead. Now the woman is doing everything possible to move forward. She doesn't want herself or her son to be associated in any way with the real Joker. Jane is tired of media attention and wants a quiet, peaceful life. Recently, Jaime Osuna has been experiencing increased paranoia but refuses to take medication, leave his cell, or talk with a psychiatrist. He constantly talks about some fear that people are setting him up and complains about this incessantly. This is the end of the story. Like the video and leave your thoughts in the comments. This was Jeremy. See you soon.